Hello everyone, my name is Benjamin Croitoru. I've been a finance professor at McGill University's Desautels Faculty of Management for about 20 years, and I'm also the academic director of the McGill Personal Finance Essentials course. My team and I at McGill have decided to record this podcast in order to highlight the importance of financial literacy, especially in the current situation with the COVID-19 pandemic having a huge impact on the finances of millions of Canadian households. And we also wanted to introduce some of the work that's being done at HEC Montreal and at McGill on the topic on financial literacy. And hopefully, we're also going to share some useful insights, practical insights on personal finance for our listeners. So why are we here today talking about financial literacy and the difference it can make in people's lives? Well, there's a lot of data that shows that personal finances are a huge cause of stress for a lot of people everywhere, and especially Canadians. For example, about a third of Canadians say that they have no retirement savings, and close to half of Canadians feel that they're overwhelmed by debt and that they live paycheck to paycheck. And a lot of people also say that money problems are the number one source of stress, even more than personal relationships, health, or work. So that's why in November 2019, McGill University launched a free online course entitled McGill Personal Finance Essentials that's offered in collaboration with the RBC Future Launch Foundation and the Globe and Mail newspaper. The course is completely free, open to everyone. It's offered year-round and fully bilingual English and French. And very importantly, the course does not assume any pre-existing knowledge. And in the course, we try to address the basic steps of one's financial life. For example, building a budget, managing debt, investing. We also discuss the impact of human psychology on financial decisions and the complexity of investing in real estate. And we're very excited that the course has been a great success because at this point we've had almost 200,000 people who have signed up to take the course. If you're interested in learning more, I invite you to go to mcgillpersonalfinance.com, or of course you can simply Google McGill Personal Finance. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest for this podcast, Professor Pierre-Carl Michaud. Pierre-Carl Michaud is a professor of economics at HEC Montreal and is also the director of HEC's Retirement and Savings Institute. He does research on the economic decisions of individuals at different stages of their life cycle, and he's published his research in leading international academic journals. He's also very active in Montreal, trying to understand policy issues such as the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on household finances, or the role of financial education. Welcome, Pierre-Carl.
Nice to chat with you, Benjamin.
So let me start by asking you, Pierre-Carl, could you please tell us a little bit about your work, your research work at HEC's Retirement and Savings Institute?
Yeah, so ever since I graduated, Benjamin, a long time ago, one might say, I was fascinated by economic behavior and policy. Like many economists, my research starts with economic theory, which is pretty good at telling us what people should do and what might be optimal in the realm of personal finance, but not so good at explaining how people make decisions and what they do in real life. And so that gap is of interest to me. And I try hard to find ways ways to bridge that gap, either with education or policy. So a few years ago at HSA with other colleagues, we scanned what was being done at the Canadian level. And we felt that there was a gap in terms of building a research agenda aimed at understanding what Canadians are doing and why, what they should do, and if there's a gap again, how to better fill the gap. So we've built the institute from ground up, bringing together people from Quebec, in the rest of Canada and abroad, to study those questions.
Great. So as I mentioned, our personal finance course has been very successful. We're very excited about this. And of course, that shows that there's a big need for helping people with their financial literacy. In your opinion, why is there such a need?
Well, I think the key point, Benjamin, is that access to financial products and services has never been easier. And so it's possible to benefit from a lot of things out there. But the prerequisite is that you have a basic set of skills, which we often call financial literacy, in order to navigate that world and really take advantage of it. So, for example, there's a lot of financial advice out there, and it's relatively cheap. But again, one needs to be able to speak the language to really take advantage of this advice. And so the best way, in my opinion, in this world to gain financial independence is to build a core set of skills, not learn rocket science, but learn a few key concepts that can act as bearings, to navigate, this world.
So many students in our personal finance course have commented that there's really a need for financial literacy to be taught in a more official, institutional way. For example, in schools, or perhaps through some kind of government program. So where do you think that financial literacy education ideally should be offered?
I think it belongs in many places. Just think about learning about compound interest, which everyone would agree is a core skill if you're to understand personal finance. And you can teach that in a high school math class. Let's say instead of learning how to compute the area, of a pentagon, which, let's be honest, is pretty useless these days, you could be learning about compound interest. And so I think, that's a great opportunity, already in high school, even in primary school, to learn about very basic concepts. If you're teaching probability, you can teach about diversification in high school or CGEP or university. So I think that's, the first place I see financial education. Now, you're not going to teach high school teenagers about RSPs and TFSA and mortgages when they're 15, and that's not going to be probably useful, and people forget, so they're not likely going to remember what you teach them once they're ready to make these decisions. So providing good quality financial education along the life cycle as people progress through these key decision points, I think is very important. And that's where I think both governments, financial institutions, and universities, so initiatives such as yours, are extremely important to keep the process going, because it's an ongoing process, and it's not something we can teach in one class when people are in high school and then forget about it.
No, I fully agree. I think it should be a lifelong process, but I think it should start sooner. I think the basics are not very complicated. I think absolutely all high school students are able to at least understand the basics. I think it should start at that point. But you are right that people forget, and it should continue well into people's adult lifetimes. So let me ask you about Canadians. How are Canadians doing nowadays in terms of saving, preparing for retirement, borrowing, etc.? And is their situation fundamentally different if you compare them to citizens of other countries?
So, it's hard to characterize generally how people are doing, but the first observation I'd make is that, people are not doing as bad as we think they're doing. The vast majority is getting by without, taking catastrophic financial decisions. And a lot of this has to do with the sort of autopilot scheme that the government and regulatory agencies have in place, which means that a lot of the decisions are already taken for us. We have to save, to do mandatory saving through the Canada Pension Plan and Quebec Pension Plan. We have extensive regulation in Canada in the mortgage, market, and so on. So, I think it's good to start with a little bit of a pat in the back, thinking that we're not doing that bad globally. Now, that said, there's clearly lots of examples of places where we can do better, and where either currently we're missing on nice opportunities in the realms of personal finance. So consumers are passing out on nice opportunities to build, let's say, retirement saving, or are making financial mistakes in terms of picking debt products, or taking, for example, the Canada Pension Plan benefit too early. So in that sense, we're not that different from other countries, I'd say, with a similar set of institutions. And I think that's important to stress. If you're in a country where all decisions are at the individual level, there's no regulation in place, there's no mandatory saving, obviously that's a nice opportunity for people to make a lot of really bad decision making. But if you're already in a setting where we think a lot about this, and we leave some portion of the personal finance sphere to individuals, but a lot of this is in some sense regulated, is enforced in ways that that people are protected against really catastrophic decisions. Now, if there's one thing where we're different from, let's say, our neighbors to the south, and perhaps especially European countries, is that we borrow a lot. We see this coming out in the news very often. So Canadians borrow a lot, and in particular using home equity. And obviously, some of this is supported by the fact that house prices have been appreciating a lot. So from a balance sheet perspective, maybe that's not that much of a concern. But clearly that's something to look for. And the other place where we might need to be very careful when we compare ourselves to other countries is that, Canada has relied extensively on what we call third pillar pensions from employers and so on. And those are the traditional DB plan, defined benefit plan, is going away. And, Canada is particularly more susceptible, Canadians are more susceptible to that trend than, say, some European countries where that's sort of a residual form of retirement savings. So, there's some things to watch out, but overall, I paint the picture as a pretty positive, with obviously some caveats.
Oh, that's good to hear. And do you think, are we seeing any progress in terms of financial literacy? Do you think that certainly more and more information is available, especially online, but do you think that people are seizing this opportunity? Do you think financial literacy is improving?
Well, we're not seeing, we measure each year. The Institute, for example, does an index of, retirement system knowledge. So how much do people understand of the retirement system? And from year to year, we don't see a lot of movement. And I think the same can be said of these financial literacy indices that exist. But perhaps that's normal because we have yet to invest massively in financial literacy. So I think we're only at the start of this movement. So we should not look for population-wide movements in terms of financial literacy at this stage. But I think we're starting to see good signs here and there. And I think the media is helping. For example, in the French media, there's TV shows like Zone Economy, previously RD Economy, which are helping out a lot. I'm not seeing that much of that in the English media, like the CBC, so it'd be nice to see more of this. I think regulatory agencies like the AMF in Quebec is doing, Autorité des marchés financiers, is doing quite well, trying to be a leader in that field. And so it's difficult to identify clear trends, but there are some indicators that excite me more, like we're seeing Canadians use more tax-preferred savings accounts like the TFSA and RRSPs, using low-cost solutions for investing. And so generally, I think Canadians are demanding more value for money from when they seek advice or when they're purchasing products. And I think that's a good thing. And that's probably reflecting some of the ongoing efforts that we're seeing out there in terms of education.
Great. So looking, of course, everybody knows the past year with the COVID pandemic has been very, well, special. Um,
Yeah.
and can I ask you, can you give us a quick summary of how you feel the COVID crisis has affected Canadians financially?
Yeah, so we did a survey very early on in the pandemic at the Institute, trying to understand what was going on early on, and then we followed up with these people as the crisis unfold. There's clearly two worlds. There's a clear divide. There's a group of people which you can define mostly by their occupational status or their industry. So people, let's say, for the sake of the discussion, in the restaurant industry or entertainment industry, that was hit hard, and typically at least one member of the household lost their job to the pandemic and maybe has not yet recuperated that job. Now, this group relied a lot on government help, but also some arrangements that were made by financial institutions, such as, for example, postponing mortgage and debt payments. Now, for most in that group, they were able to smooth out pretty well the crisis in terms of consumption expenditures because of everything that was available. And the key decision point for them going forward is trying to think, well, are things going to go back to normal, or should they now try and think very differently about their financial situation, perhaps changing jobs or occupation? And so that group, I think, has to wrestle with very difficult decisions right now. The second group had it much easier. They were affected, obviously, like everyone, by COVID, but they mostly worked from home. Their expenditures decreased a lot. Their income remained constant, and so they saved a lot. The saving rate in Canada is at historical highs. And so for this group, they've been paying down mortgages, doing renovations, sometimes investing the money. And really the question that group is asking, one set of questions that they ought to be asking themselves is, whether, this is going to be temporary or permanent. And again, trying to think, well, where I'm going to make one-time large expenditures or financial decisions, need to be worried about what might happen in the future. So, for example, buying a very huge house because you have a lot of saving is nice, but on the other hand, if your income hasn't changed in the future, maybe you're not able to do the repairs to the house within 5 years, or to make mortgage payments. So there's, in both situations, I think what's interesting is both groups went very differently to the crisis, but they face similar decisions coming out as to whether things are permanently changed or whether they were just transitory.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks. So let me ask you, what do you think are some big misunderstandings or misconceptions that exist in the field of personal finance?
Well, I mean, in terms of misconceptions, I think that, and I alluded to that when we started, the biggest one is probably that generalizing that people are dumb and that they do not understand personal finances. I think lots of people are doing okay, and the word to stress there is with the information that they have. And I think that collectively, very often, we're judging decisions that people are making as bad or bad decisions, but we're not necessarily helping them a lot in terms of information out there. So, for example, at the Institute, we're working hard on decision aids, so tools that you provide online that help people make sense of complex decision. So the rule we have typically, and that we've seen when we look at the quality of financial decision making is the 20%, 80% rule, which is that, in many domains, 80% of the population is doing relatively well. It varies. And then there's a group struggling. And so the key issue is identifying that group, understanding the biases that may be at play, and then trying to target that group in terms if it's education or regulation. And that's a pretty effective way of thinking about policy making rather than just thinking about broad sweeps or broad policies that affect a lot of people that are already doing relatively well. A second misconception is that debt is bad. We hear this a lot, and there's a lot of stigma around debt. But from an economic standpoint, debt is an extremely important financial innovation. And if you just think of home equity lines of credit, as house prices have been skyrocketing in many places, and people were income or cash poor, but asset rich, had really big houses. I mean, a very effective way of extracting home equity and using it to finance consumption projects is actually using ELOCs. And so, debt is there to smooth consumption, respond to shocks. We've seen it with the pandemic. And so I think this needs to be taken into consideration when we look at the financial situation of households. I could go on and on. I don't know if you want me to, Benjamin.
But maybe not. But let me ask you. So you mentioned the fact that maybe 80% of people do okay, 20% don't. So if you had to to pick maybe a couple of big mistakes that those 20% tend to make.
Yeah. So I think, for example, the generally the field, the decision to delay Canada pension plan benefits or Quebec pension plan benefits is a really important one. In Quebec, more than half the population reaching the age of 60 takes up benefits at the earliest age possible. And if you think about it, if you're an average person, with average life expectancy, delaying that pension by 1 year provides a safe inflation index annuity stream of income, which represents approximately a 10% return annually. And so try and find that on the market, a safe return that, inflation index 10%. And so a lot of people are seeing that decision and the way the information is presented, take up these benefits very early. And according to our calculations, that's maybe a 20-30% of the population among that group. And this is a way of building retirement wealth or building retirement income that is escaping a lot of people. And so this is one example. Now, a lot of people are delaying, and a lot of people are taking it early because it's the right decision for them to do. Maybe they have health problems, maybe they need the money. And so really, again, when you look very carefully at some decisions, you're going to see that some people are apparently doing a mistake, but you need to be very careful about judging that and really looking at the theory behind it to be able to say, well, there's a certain group that is not making the right decision. I think too often we jump to the conclusion, seeing some form of behavior, that it's a mistake, when we need to be very careful about analyzing the underlying circumstances of the individual. And that's where our work, tries to make progress.
Yes, so as an investment professor, I certainly agree with this. Delaying the start of your Quebec pension, if you can do it, is probably for many people a great deal. And if I had to give again as an investment professor an example of a mistake that many people make, in my opinion, perhaps the number one is that people have a tendency to buy and sell, to get in and out of the stock market based on the dominant mood in the market. They tend to buy stocks when stocks look good, when they have been going up for a while. They tend to sell when the mood is depressed, when stocks have been going down. But of course, if you do that, you buy stocks when they're already expensive, you sell when they've been going down, when they're very cheap. Obviously, buying expensive, selling cheap, that's a disaster for your long-term return. So to me, that's perhaps the number one mistake that people very typically make.
And Benjamin, I mean, in some sense, if you think about it, back in the day, 30 years ago, you'd have to go through a broker or an advisor to make these sort of decisions, and a lot of them would, be people like you would stop you from doing it. Would say that's a bad decision, don't do it. I think one of the issue right now with investing is, in particular, that it's so accessible. And so easy to do that a lot of these things need to be brought back into the discussion, and lots of education needs to be done on this. Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. I mean, online investing is a great opportunity, but it makes it even easier to make mistakes. So let's talk a little bit more about investing. One thing I've observed is that a lot of people feel overwhelmed with the thousands of investing choices that are available to them. And well, with online investing becoming easier and easier, certainly people have more and more options. So how do you think someone can simplify these decisions and increase their chances of a long and financially safe retirement?
Well, that's a great question. In particular, when you think about investing, let's say for retirement or building a nest egg, we're talking about long-term investment. And there's the truth of the matter is that keeping it simple, diversified, is actually the best advice one can be given. And maybe that used to be more difficult to do, but that's now very extremely easy to do for most Canadians. And the truth is that if Canadians try and invest on their own, picking stocks, just like most advisors probably have trouble with, I mean, you cannot beat consistently the market when it comes to investing. So if you're in there for the long run, the key thing is having some form of automatic pilot that allows you to use, for example, index funds, very low fees, pretty easy to trade, if you think of rebalancing. And not looking at your portfolio every day is probably the best advice you can give someone. And of course, that's difficult nowadays. You have apps on your phone and you can look at your account balance at the end of the day. But that's probably giving an incentive for a lot of people to actually overtrade or trade too often. I think something to stress in terms of long-term investing, Benjamin, is putting your money in tax-favored savings vehicle. Actually is going to boost returns relative to the standard investment. And it's amazing to see in the data we have from tax returns and what Canadians are doing that you see a lot of investment outside of these vehicles when people have space, contribution space. And that means you need to work much harder to get returns than basically simply investing through these accounts. So I think these are some of the core principles that I think I've been taught by a lot of people for a long time, but I think need to be stressed again and again.
Great. Yeah, I could not agree more. And by the way, these are some of the topics: index funds, diversification, tax sheltered accounts. These are some of the topics that we discuss in the Personal Finance Essentials course. So
Great.
So for the last few minutes, we've been talking about individual decision making, but Pierre-Carl, you've also worked a lot on public policy. So at a public policy level, what do you think Canadians should be expecting or advocating for?
So I think there's one area that we haven't discussed collectively enough, and we're seeing actually with the pandemic, and it's actually the impending crisis that we're going to face with long-term care, and that has financial implications for Canadians. Governments in the next 10, 20 years are going to have a hard time providing services at a low cost to Canadians when it comes to taking care of them when they lose their autonomy. And the cost of a private long-term care home or home care services in the private sector is extremely expensive. And I think we need collectively, but also at the individual level, to think about that and think about what it means for retirement asset accumulation. I think the financial industry is also reckoning with this, what's coming ahead. And so we need to think hard about the type of products that would be important to have. I think the government I think the population needs to ask their government for a plan. What's the plan? How are we going to face this in the next 20 years? And providing much more information. There's a misconception that when you get old, the government takes care of you and it doesn't cost you anything. And first of all, it's not true today. But in 20 years or 15 years, for the current retirees that are reaching retirement age, it's not going to be the case. And so, we need to think very hard about this individually and collectively.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're now getting near the end of this podcast. So I would really like it if our listeners could pick up some truly practical, actionable, simple advice from this. So keeping it simple, maybe in 2 or 3 points, what would be the most important advice you would give to young people who are just starting their financial journeys?
Yeah, so I think people should be simplifying things and not trying to think too much that they can do it. For example, if we think about investment, they can beat the market, and so keeping it simple. Ask for value when someone is asking you to pay a fee is probably something that is going to be extremely important in the future, and I think the financial industry is expecting that. So when you're being asked for a 2% fee on something, ask questions. What am I getting for this? Keeping things diversified. I think the pandemic has shown that we need to have a rainy day fund, and so not only think about long term, but think about short term, and use tools that are available to project yourself into the future, not only to figure out what is the most likely scenario that might happen, but ask a lot of what if questions. Like if you think about your personal situation. What if this would happen? Am I prepared? What would I have as an exit strategy if this happened? And so I think that's very important in the years ahead for household. Keeping it simple, diversified, ask for value in advice, and then ask what if questions. Project yourself into the future.
Great. Thank you very much, Pierre-Carl. So I really like what you've said about keeping it simple, because in my opinion, the number one misconception that people have is that finance and financial planning has to be really complicated. But that's not true. So of course, if you want to become a finance professional, there's a lot that you need to know, but there is not that much that you need to know in order to make a real difference in terms of financial security and hopefully sleep better at night. So if you want to learn the basics that again will make a real difference, well, certainly I would like to invite our listeners to check out our McGill Personal Finance Essentials course. And I would also like to invite everyone to check out the work that's done at HEC's Retirement and Savings Institute. And the website is rsi.hec.ca, where you can find more information. So let me conclude by thanking one more time our guest, Professor Pierre-Carl Michaud, and by wishing all our listeners good luck, all the best in your financial planning journey.